Welcome to Lesson 3 of the course, Cooperative Individualism, the Third Way to the Just Society. This lesson is titled Evolving Left-Right Paradigms. Throughout history, uprisings against the established order were sometimes spontaneous. However, many were also sparked by persuasive expressions of opposition to the ruling elite and to the basis upon which they assumed power. During the 7 decades of the life of Thomas Paine, these struggles for power and against those holding power occurred within an evolving ideological framework. In practical terms, individuals lined up one side or the other of the left-right paradigm. We can rightfully look to that generation of practical philosophers and political activists who in North America challenged the right of arbitrary rule by the English monarch as lighting the torch of cooperative individualism. Of course, they did so absent a full appreciation for the principles of Locke and Turgot, from whose writings Paine greatly benefited. In 1942, economist Peter F Drucker took time to reflect on how humanity had come to yet another global war. He offered a unique, for the time, insight into the circumstances that brought the United States of America into existence. Drucker writes, "Far from being a revolt against the old tyranny of feudalism, the American Revolution was a conservative counter-revolution in the name of freedom against the new tyranny of rationalist liberalism and enlightened despotism. The American Revolution succeeded in building not only a functioning, but a free society." Drucker's use of the phrase free society is certainly subject to argument. However, of almost equal importance was the wider Old World reaction to the emergence of this new republic in North America. As Peter Drucker observes, "The American Revolution defeated the rationalist liberals and their pupils, the enlightened despots, who had seemingly been irresistible and within an inch of complete and final victory. It brought victory and power to a group which in Europe had been almost completely defeated, and with their hostility to absolute and centralized government and their distrust of any ruler claiming perfection." Conditions in Britain had never lived up to the promise of the glorious revolution of 1688. By the time George III committed the nation's diminishing resources to holding on to Britain's colonies in North America, the urgent need for societal and governmental reforms was evident to many thoughtful persons, including intellectuals such as Adam Smith. The long war in America heightened widespread public unrest. I again quote from Peter Drucker. True, there were no serfs in England as there were on the continent, but there was an army of dispossessed, victims of the enclosures, victims of early industrialization, victims of rack renting and of urban poverty. Nowhere on the continent was there anything comparable to the misery and squalor of the London slums with their gin alleys, or to the horror of child labor in Manchester. A new government assumed power in 1783, with William Pitt the Younger appointed Prime Minister. The new government's immediate challenge was how to raise sufficient revenue to pay for the war debt. Pitt imposed new taxes, including Britain's first income tax. His measures to simplify customs and excise duties reduced both smuggling and violation of Britain's commercial regulations, a supply-side strategy that over time actually increased revenue to the government. The political climate encouraged men such as journalist William Cobbett to call for further reforms. He began publishing a weekly, the Political Register, in 1802, and soon began to challenge government policies. This was too much for the establishment, and Cobbett was imprisoned for 2 years for his outspoken condemnation of government policies. The government continued to clamp down hard on dissent, and in 1817, Cobbett was forced to flee to the United States to avoid arrest. Returning 2 years later, he continued to work for various reforms, and 3 years before his death in 1835, he was elected to Parliament. It seemed the times were finally changing. Cobbett had read Thomas Paine's Rights of Man in 1792. However, after the publication of Age of Reason in 1796, Cobbett referred to Paine as, quote, Mad Tom. Paine's attack on organized religion was particularly untimely, as Americans were in the midst of an evangelical religious revival. Yet Cobbett later embraced Paine's views on the state of Britain's finances and financial system, and by 1817, he announced his intention to write a detailed and factual biography of Thomas Paine. Paine was gone, but not totally forgotten. His writings would find new readers in every coming generation. The physiocratic framework for an evolving system of cooperative individualism was dealt a deathly blow by the time of the French Revolution. François Quesnay had died in 1774. Turgot died in 1781. Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours served as Inspector General of Commerce under Louis XV and helped negotiate the Treaty of 1783. Despite his experience in the government of Louis XVI, he initially supported the French Revolution and served as president of the National Constituent Assembly. During the Reign of Terror, Dupont was condemned and escaped execution only when Robespierre fell and was himself sent to the guillotine. However, after his family home was sacked by a mob in 1797, Dupont took his family to the United States, where he remained until his death in 1817. Soon after Dupont was settled in the United States, he began a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, letters that covered a wide variety of subjects and pressing matters of the day. In 1802, Jefferson wrote the following back to Dupont. When this government was first established, it was possible to have set it going on two principles, but the contracted English half-lettered ideas of Hamilton destroyed that hope in the bud. We can pay off his debt in 15 years, but we can never get rid of his financial system. It mortifies me to be strengthened by principles which I deem radically vicious, but this vice is entailed on us by a just error. In other parts of our government, I hope we shall be able by degrees to introduce sound principles and make them habitual. What is practicable must often control what is pure theory, and the habits of the governed determine in a great degree what is practicable. Hence, the same original principles, modified in practice according to the different habits of different nations, present governments of very different aspects. The same principles reduced to forms of practice accommodated to our habits and put into forms accommodated to the habits of the French nation would present governments very unlike each other. I have no doubt that a great man, thoroughly knowing the habits of France, might so accommodate to them the principles of free governments as to enable them to live free. But in the hands of those who have not this coup d'oeil, many unsuccessful experiments, I fear, are yet to be tried before they will settle down in freedom and tranquility. I applaud, therefore, your determination to remain here, and will, I doubt not, be happier here than they could have been in Europe under any circumstances. Neither DuPont nor Jefferson would live to see the United States experience the consequences of what Ferdinand Lundberg described in 1980 as, quote, cracks in the Constitution. Americans and new arrivals were too absorbed with rushing from the Atlantic towns into the frontier to reflect on constitutional problems. 61 years passed between passage of the 12th Amendment in 1804, mandating a separate election to the offices of President and Vice President, and the 13th Amendment in 1865, more or less outlawing slavery. While Britain inched toward a less arbitrary Republican government, Reaction to centralized authority on the European continent took the form of socialist experiment. Writers as diverse in their views as Thomas Spence, William Ogilvy, and Jean Meslier all called for the nationalization of the land to remedy the poverty of a landless majority. Land nationalization would remain as a central reform incorporated in the socialist program. Others introduced their own utopian ideas with limited general appeal. Claude de Saint-Simon sought to reorganize French society by recruiting the brightest men to manage the national economy. François Fourier also argued the case for a planned economy. Robert Owen developed the theory of industrial cooperatives to improve the lives of laboring people. In 1824, Owen came to the United States, establishing the cooperative community of New Harmony in Indiana, which proved to be a short-lived experiment. The European world was then introduced to very different ideas of societal organization by the Frenchman Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Early in life, he was deeply moved by the poverty and destitution he saw when he came to Paris. In 1840, his most widely read work, What is Property?, was published. Proudhon's views are well summarized by Edward Hyams. Far from utterly condemning property, he believed that possession of a house to live in, a plot of land to grow food on, and the tools of his trade were the minimum requirement for man's liberty. What, on the other hand, no man had a shadow of right to was the accumulated capital which enabled him to exploit other men. Proudhon's moral sense of right and wrong reaches back to the very fundamental relation between us and the planet, on which we are all equally dependent. Labor gives birth to private possession, the right in a thing, jus in re. But in what thing? Evidently in the product, not in the soil. The inequality which results from the pretended right of the first occupant seems to them to be based on no principle of justice. And when all the land falls into the hands of a certain number of inhabitants, there results a monopoly in their favor against the rest of the nation, to which they do not wish to submit. Proudhon's response was to advance a sort of organic socialism within which working class people could thrive. His vision was of societies within societies, guided by mutualist principles, countering the interests and privileges of the propertied class. Proudhon argued against the inevitability of poverty as theorized by Malthus, and he rejected state socialism as envisioned by Marx. For the overwhelming majority of people living in any of the Eurasian nations, life was extremely harsh and incomes almost universally at subsistence. Rural populations declined as land was converted from crop production to the raising of sheep and cattle, and as the ancient commons were enclosed by laws orchestrated by landed interests. Peasants who moved into the cities and towns were crowded into disease-ridden slums and competed with one another for what work was available. Descent reached a crisis point in 1848, following several years of food shortages, rising prices, widespread unemployment, and the spread of hunger-related disease and deaths. In France, King Louis Philippe abdicated and a republic was established. Pressed by an armed socialist gathering, the new government committed to provide work for all citizens and to recognize the rights of workers to organize. Elsewhere throughout Europe, popular uprisings followed. German activists agitated for an all-German parliament under a formal constitution, for freedom of the press and other democratic reforms. Fighting broke out in Berlin between pro- and anti-monarchy forces until King Frederick William ordered the withdrawal of his soldiers and then embraced the revolution as a necessary step toward German unification. In France, the new government proved incapable of meeting the commitments made to create jobs and increase food production. French citizens responded by electing Louis Napoleon Bonaparte president of the Republic. One European nation after another experienced protest, chaos, and reactionary responses. In 1852, Louis was crowned Emperor of the Second Empire and ruled France until his capture during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, followed by 3 years of exile in England, where he died in 1873. In his book Revolution and Reaction, 1848 to 1852, historian Geoffrey Brun succinctly put the uprisings of 1848 into perspective. Radical socialist reformers sought justice for the disinherited classes, the peasants and the factory workers, while more moderate political reformers were concerned with protecting and increasing the influence of the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, and the professional groups. The radicals in general favored a republican form of government, while many moderates were prepared to accept constitutional monarchy as a satisfactory substitute. Many of the revolutionaries, especially in the Germanies and Italy, wanted to transform their homeland into a strong and united country, but their aims contradicted the nationalist aspirations of minority groups. Proudhon had anticipated the course of events. From prison in 1850, he wrote, "I have produced a lot of ideas, done some good, conscientious work, all thrown away. Mankind wants to be ruled. Ruled it will be. I am ashamed of my species." While Karl Marx would toil away in obscurity living in London, Engels returning after 1848 to Manchester, the leading lights of progressive reform embraced the incremental objectives associated with social democracy or democratic socialism. This movement blossomed in Germany under the leadership of Ferdinand Lassalle. Lassalle's thinking was influenced more by Proudhon than by Marx. He supported the creation of workers' industrial cooperatives to undermine the power of bourgeois capitalism. Yet he sought financial subsidies from the Prussian state. Slowly, the reach of cooperative enterprises grew and expanded into something of a global movement. The Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany was founded in 1869, with August Bebel its leading figure. Bebel and one other Social Democrat were elected to the Reichstag in 1871. Other social democratic parties were organized throughout Europe at the same time. In Britain, the Fabian Society was formed by George Bernard Shaw and others, embracing the gradualist adoption of democratic socialism. The modern era struggle to win the hearts and minds, or the acquiescence of the masses, was now firmly in place. Factions within each extreme argued less over objectives than over methods. The small number of adherents to the principles of cooperative individualism were crowded out by voices on the left or on the right. It would take the emergence of a committed and charismatic person to lift the fallen torch once carried by Thomas Paine and his physiocratic mentors. And with that, we've reached the end of Lesson 3.